Hello and welcome back to the course Private Pilot Maneuvers. Today we'll discuss short feet takeoffs. Now, of course, the first question that comes to mind is what is meant by short? That's of course a relative term. It depends, for example, on the airplane you're flying. But I would define short as any time when you have only little margins in your takeoff performance. So the runway length is somewhat limited. And also you may have additional obstacles behind your runway. So it's really important before a short field departure to check your performance in the pilot's operating handbook. That's the first step. And if that's okay, the second and equally important step is just before departure to check again if the conditions are still valid. So it's no use calculating your takeoff performance with a 5-knot headwind when then in fact later on you take off with a 3-knot tailwind, for example. So it's important just before takeoff, take another look at the windsock especially, and get the QNH and temperature, and just find out if your takeoff performance is still valid. Now, in the graphs and charts in your pilot's operating handbook, you will normally have parameters considered like, of course, pressure, altitude, and temperature, essentially giving you density, altitude, then, and wind. What's often not included is, for example, slope. So if the runway is upsloping on your takeoff, of course, that's bad, and the downslope is good. Unfortunately, in many operating handbooks, there is no information about slope. I have found 2 examples where the influence on slope is actually considered. Now, in the first one, it says for every 2% of upslope, you should add 15% to your takeoff distance. And the other handbooks of the other airplane says you should add 9% for every 1% of slope. So it's roughly the same. We could assume that it's a 10% increase per 1% slope with this airplane. So if there's information in the operating handbook of your airplane, use that. There's nothing in the Cessna 152's handbook, unfortunately. But basically, if you take those numbers, it would tell you that if you have a 500-meter takeoff distance and a 2% upslope, that you would actually have to add 20% to that. So you would actually have 600 meters. So your takeoff distance would be 100 meters long, which of course is substantial. Then again, you have to find a trade-off with the wind. So you might want to go downslope, but what if you have a 10-knot tailwind? So this is something that really needs to be worked out with all the information you can get. Especially if you have to climb over some obstacles after the runway, after liftoff, you need to know your speeds, especially Vx, the best angle of climb speed, and also the attitude for that, and as well as your Vy speed. If there are no obstacles after the runway, of course, you can accelerate to Vy or even a higher speed earlier. Just keep in mind, the longer you fly Vx, the closer you will be to the runway at a higher altitude. So this might give you better opportunities in case of an engine failure after takeoff when you want to return to the field, which, however, in 90% of the cases is not a good idea, but we'll take a look at that in the lesson about engine failures. It's not only important to know your speeds like Vx, it's also important to fly them precisely, because depending on the airplane, being even just a few knots off may mean a considerable reduction in climb performance. So keep that in mind. So to actually conduct our takeoff, we want to use all runway length available. So really taxi to the end, right to the end. Do not waste any meters. And then stop the airplane when it's lined up with the runway, hold the brakes, and then apply takeoff power, still holding the brakes. Now, when you release the brakes, you will have the full RPM, the full power already there. However, well, some pilots do that, some don't. Don't expect miracles from that. You won't gain a substantial reduction in takeoff distance by applying this technique. It may give you a few meters. So it's not really something you can do to make up for a performance calculation that's too bad. Keep that in mind. It might just give you a few meters. But then again, maybe if it's really critical, those may be the few meters that you just need. Very important also, do all your pre-departure checks very precisely. For example, normally you use flaps for a short field takeoff. So for the Cessna 152, for example, you use 10 degrees of flaps. And it's really a bad thing if you forget to do that. And you try to take off with flaps up. Also, what's important, if you're departing from a high altitude airfield, check your mixture. For example, in the Cessna 152 handbook, it says if you're departing an airfield that's above 3,000 feet MSL, you need to lean your mixture for maximum RPM. Otherwise, you will not have maximum takeoff power. The mixture will be too rich. Okay, then you do a normal takeoff actually. Right rudder due to the propeller effects, just as you're used to. And then, depending on the airplane, you can either rotate directly at VX and then climb at VX, but most airplanes will want to fly earlier than that, so you can just do your normal rotation, and then it's just important, if you're still below VX speed, to stay in ground effect. We'll talk about it in a minute. Stay in ground effect until you have actually reached VX, and only then climb further. In the Cessna 152 handbook for a short field takeoff, there's actually no rotation speed given. For normal takeoffs, it's 50 knots. In the Cessna 152 handbook, it just says you should climb with 54 knots until clear of obstacles, and then accelerate to 55 knots, which is VX. That sounds a bit academic, to accelerate from 54 to 55 knots. I just say you should keep your speed as close to 55 knots as possible. And if you rotate at 50 knots, you'll probably have 55 knots already when you lift off. Otherwise, just stay in ground effect until you have it. And then, when you've reached a safe altitude, you can increase your speed to VY, for example. Just keep in mind, if you really want to clear those obstacles, you have to fly VX as precisely as possible. And then, when you've reached a safe altitude, you have a safe speed, for example, accelerate to 60 knots or more in the Cessna 152, and then retract your flaps and just climb to your cruising altitude. Now, we've talked about ground effect a little before. So here on this image, you can see takeoff in ground effect. So if you're really limited on performance, the airplane might be able to fly in ground effect at a pretty slow speed, but it won't be able to climb out of it. And if you do that prematurely, it might settle back onto the runway, or it just might keep skipping along just on the top of the ground effect area, but will never be able to climb, and then eventually at the end of the runway you will hit your obstacles. So always stay in ground effect after landing until you have, after liftoff, of course, until you have reached a safe speed, which is normally VX, and then, and only then, leave ground effect. That's important, because the airplane may seem to be able to fly, but that's just because it's in ground effect, and then as soon as you pull it out, it settles back onto the runway, or it simply stops climbing. This is what happens when you do a premature liftoff out of ground effect. Then the airplane will settle, or may settle back to the ground. But then maybe you realize your problem and abort to takeoff. But it's even worse, I think, and many accidents have happened that way, when the pilots try to keep the airplane flying at a too slow speed. It's flying in ground effect, and they just try to get it out of ground effect for seconds and seconds, but they are unable to do that, and in the end they hit the obstacles. So the only option for them would have been to abort the takeoff or to really accelerate to a safe speed and then pull out of ground effect, even if that means going directly towards your obstacles a little bit longer and then actually pull out. So don't fall for the temptation to pull prematurely out of ground effect. Then there's another important thing I would like to talk about, and that is, when should you abort a takeoff? Now, with a very short runway, of course, you're also limited in case of a takeoff abortion. So you may overrun the runway if you abort the takeoff pretty late. Now, if you have an engine failure, you have no choice. You will abort the takeoff, or the takeoff will be aborted for you, actually. But you might have quite a few other problems, like some warning lights or a seat not adjusted, whatever it is that makes you want to abort the takeoff. And with a short field takeoff especially, one of those reasons also is insufficient performance. So it's good if you recognize early enough that you don't have the performance required to do the takeoff safely. Now, how can you do that? One good rule of thumb is that you should have reached 2/3 of your takeoff speed when reaching the half of the runway. So when the runway is 600 meters long, after 300 meters, you should have reached not half of your takeoff speed, but 2/3 of it. Now, why is that? Because during a normal takeoff, you're accelerating, and for the given conditions, this acceleration from 0 to your takeoff speed takes a certain amount of time. It's always the same amount in the same conditions. But during the second half, for example, the later parts of your takeoff roll, you will have a much higher ground speed. So in a given second, you'll cover much more ground than at the start of your takeoff roll. And that's why it's not sufficient, if it's a really short runway, it's not sufficient that you have half your takeoff speed at half runway. You need 2/3. So it's a good idea before takeoff to calculate that speed. Let's say you have an airplane that rotates at 60 knots. 2/3 of that is 40 knots. So you would really like to have 40 knots at half runway. And for that to work, maybe you have half runway markings, but if not, it's a good idea to find some reference points on the ground, maybe a hangar, maybe a tree, whatever it is that you take as your reference for half runway. And when you're abeam it, then you should check if you have 2/3 of your takeoff speed. All right, this concludes the briefing for short field takeoffs. So let's try this out. I see you in the airplane.